A billionaire's world shattered in an instant when he returned home unannounced. The sight that greeted him left him frozen at the threshold of his own mansion, unable to comprehend what his eyes were witnessing between the black maid and his son. Nothing could have prepared him for this revelation. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The rain beat against the marble steps as Carlos Costa quietly pushed open the door of his São Paulo mansion, the weight of 6 months away pressing on his shoulders. The familiar scent of polished wood and expensive fragrance greeted him, yet something felt different. He had returned unannounced, preferring to surprise his household rather than allow them to prepare a facade for his arrival. 6 months of international business deals had kept him away far longer than intended. Dropping his leather briefcase onto the imported Italian tiles, Carlos froze. There, under the grand staircase with its ornate railings, was a scene that made his blood run cold. His 6-year-old son, Daniel Costa, was clinging desperately to Maria Silva, the household maid. The boy was trembling, his small fingers gripping her apron as if it were a lifeline in a storm. His face was buried against her uniform, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Carlos's heart stuttered in his chest. The businessman who commanded boardrooms with unwavering authority now stood paralyzed, torn between guilt and suspicion. Why was his son so distressed, and why was he seeking comfort from the help rather than waiting for his father's return? Maria met his gaze across the expansive foyer, her expression a mixture of calm professionalism and fierce protectiveness. She didn't flinch under his scrutiny, instead placing a gentle hand on Daniel's head while maintaining eye contact with her employer. The silent challenge in her stance was unmistakable. She would not apologize for comforting this child. "Papa is home," she whispered to the boy, her voice barely audible over the rain pounding against the windows. Daniel turned slowly, his tear-streaked face a painful reminder of how much Carlos had missed. The child made no move to run to his father. Instead, pressing closer to Maria's side, "Welcome home, sir," Maria said formally, one hand still resting on Daniel's shoulder. The memory of his wife's departure still haunted Carlos, the empty closets, the note on his desk, the finality of it all. Now, seeing his son seek comfort in someone else's arms felt like a silent accusation, a reminder of his failures as a father. Eduardo Pereira appeared from the direction of the kitchen, the loyal chauffeur's face registering surprise at his employer's unexpected arrival. He nodded respectfully, but remained silent, another witness to this uncomfortable reunion. Carlos straightened his posture, falling back on the control that had built his empire. "Daniel," he said, his voice softer than intended, "come greet your father properly." The boy hesitated, looking up at Maria as if seeking permission or courage. The exchange lasted only seconds, but revealed volumes about how much had changed in the mansion during his absence. Carlos Costa had built his empire on meticulous attention to detail. For years, he'd prided himself on never missing a single decimal point in financial reports or forgetting the name of an investor's spouse. His Morumbi mansion, with its precisely trimmed hedges and strategically placed artwork, reflected this obsession with order and control. Even his schedule was a masterpiece of efficiency, meetings timed to the minute, flights booked months in advance, every aspect of his life arranged with surgical precision. But now, standing in his marble foyer, the billionaire felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The image of Maria Silva holding Daniel wouldn't leave his mind. The way his son had clung to her, seeking comfort in her arms, rather than running to his father. It pierced through Carlos's carefully constructed facade. He retreated to his study, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. The room, with its leather-bound books and imported furniture, had always been his sanctuary. Tonight, it felt like a prison. Carlos poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light as thunder rumbled outside. "What did you expect?" he muttered to himself, swirling the drink. 6 months away, and you thought he'd welcome you with open arms. The rain intensified, pelting against the windows like an accusation. Carlos moved to his desk, fingers tracing the edge of a silver-framed photograph, Daniel at 4, laughing on a beach in Guarujá. The boy in that photo seemed worlds away from the frightened child he'd just encountered. Eduardo had tried to warn him during their drive from the airport. "The young master misses you," the chauffeur had said carefully. "He asks about you every day." Carlos had dismissed it as small talk. Another item to be acknowledged and filed away. Now, the weight of his negligence pressed down on him. While he'd been securing deals across Europe and Asia, his son had been forming a bond with someone else. Maria had stepped into the void he'd created, not through tragedy or circumstance, but through his own choices. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the room. In that stark moment of clarity, Carlos recognized the fear gripping him. He was becoming a stranger to his own son. All his wealth, his power, his carefully maintained control meant nothing if Daniel looked to others for the comfort a father should provide. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. Carlos drained his glass, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the ache in his chest. This wasn't a problem he could delegate or solve with money. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Carlos Costa faced a challenge his usual tools couldn't fix, and the rumbling sky outside felt like a warning he could no longer ignore. Maria Silva walked with her head held high through the marble-floored corridors of the Costa mansion. 3 days had passed since Carlos's unexpected return, and the whispers had already begun. She caught fragments of hushed conversations that fell silent as she approached, servants exchanging knowing glances, security guards suddenly finding something interesting to look at on their phones. "She thinks she's his mother now," Maria overheard one of the kitchen staff murmur when they thought she was out of earshot. The comment stung, but she refused to show it. The judgment wasn't confined to the mansion walls. During her weekly trip to the local market in Morumbi, Maria noticed how the other domestic workers from neighboring estates watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Even worse were the evaluating stares from the elite residents who recognized her as the Costa maid, their eyes following her movements as if searching for evidence of impropriety. Clara Martins had been particularly venomous yesterday, cornering Maria near the garden gate while walking her pedigree dog. "Such dedication to another woman's child," she had remarked with a saccharine smile that didn't reach her eyes. "One might wonder about your motivations." But these social barbs were merely annoyances compared to her real fear. Each morning, Maria woke with a knot in her stomach, wondering if today would be the day Carlos Costa decided she had overstepped her boundaries. Losing this job would mean more than just financial hardship. It would tear her away from Daniel, who needed stability now more than ever. So she channeled her anxiety into routine. Every morning, she carefully packed Daniel's lunchbox with his favorite fruits cut into star shapes. She brushed his dark hair with gentle strokes, singing soft Brazilian lullabies her own mother had once sung to her. When his small fingers clutched at her apron, as they walked to the waiting car where Eduardo Pereira would drive him to school, she felt both joy and heartache. "Will Papa be home when I return?" Daniel asked that morning. His voice small against the backdrop of São Paulo's morning traffic. "Yes, querido," she answered, straightening his school uniform collar. "And we'll have your favorite brigadeiros waiting." As Eduardo pulled away with Danielle waving from the back seat, Maria turned to face the mansion, a beautiful prison of marble and glass where warmth seemed to evaporate in the air conditioning. She squared her shoulders and walked back inside. determined to create pockets of love and safety for Daniel, even as coldness drifted through these grand, echoing halls. Eduardo Pereira gripped the steering wheel of the luxury sedan, watching through the rearview mirror as Daniel Costa fidgeted with his seatbelt. The chauffeur had been driving for the Costa family for 8 years, long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. The tension in the mansion had become palpable since Carlos's return, hanging in the air like the heavy São Paulo humidity before a storm. "Did you have a good day at school, young man?" Eduardo asked gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Daniel nodded without enthusiasm, clutching his lunchbox, the one Maria had carefully packed that morning with his favorite sandwich and a handwritten note. The boy had been vibrant just weeks ago, but Eduardo noticed how his small shoulders now hunched forward, how his responses became clipped whenever his father was mentioned. That afternoon, while waiting for Daniel outside the private school in Morumbi, Eduardo had rehearsed what he might say to Carlos. The chauffeur had observed the subtle changes in the 6-year-old, the nervous glances toward the study door, the way his laughter evaporated like morning dew when his father entered a room, the anxious twisting of fingers when Carlos asked about his day. "Sir," Eduardo had ventured later that evening, as Carlos checked messages on his smartphone in the back seat, "Daniel seems a bit different lately. Perhaps a day at Ibirapuera Park might lift his spirits." Carlos had barely looked up. "He's fine, Eduardo. Children have moods." The dismissal stung, but Eduardo persisted. "Maria mentioned he's been having trouble sleeping. Maybe—" "I don't need parenting advice from my staff," Carlos cut in, his tone final. Eduardo fell silent, focusing on navigating through the congested streets toward the high-rise where Carlos had scheduled a business meeting. The chauffeur understood boundaries. He wasn't family, merely an employee, but his loyalty extended beyond driving the vehicle. He cared deeply for the boy who once begged to sit up front and pretend to drive. In the quiet moments between destinations, Eduardo sometimes caught glimpses of the old Carlos, the man who'd once delayed an important meeting to watch Daniel's preschool performance. That man seemed buried now beneath spreadsheets and conference calls, the warmth in his eyes dimmed by whatever had driven his wife away. Still, Eduardo remained hopeful. He'd witnessed the billionaire overcome impossible business challenges through sheer determination. Perhaps Carlos would eventually see what was happening right before his eyes, before the distance between father and son became too vast to bridge. Clara Martins stood at her bay window, manicured nails tapping against her crystal champagne flute, as she observed Maria Silva walking Daniel Costa to the waiting car. The chauffeur, Eduardo Pereira, greeted them with a warm smile that made Clara's lips curl with distaste. "Quite cozy, aren't they?" she murmured to her husband, who barely glanced up from his financial newspaper. "That maid has certainly made herself indispensable to the Costa household." Clara had built her reputation in Morumbi as the gatekeeper of propriety. With her charity committee leadership and flawless dinner parties, she considered herself the neighborhood's moral compass. The return of Carlos Costa and the unusual dynamic she witnessed between him, his son, and their maid provided fresh material for her social manipulations. At her weekly bridge game, she leaned forward conspiratorially. "Have you noticed how that Silva woman handles the Costa boy, almost as if she were his mother?" She paused for effect, and Carlos allows it. Makes one wonder what else he allows. The seed planted, Clara watched with satisfaction as her friends exchanged glances. By dessert, speculation had blossomed into whispered theories about Maria's intentions and Carlos's judgment. "I'm simply concerned for little Daniel," she insisted, her voice dripping with false compassion. "Children need proper guidance, not confusion about boundaries." The rumors spread through the exclusive community like wildfire. At the country club, mothers pulled their children closer when Maria accompanied Daniel to swimming lessons. At charity galas, Carlos's business associates exchanged knowing looks when his household was mentioned. Clara's campaign was subtle but relentless. A question here about Maria's background, a comment there about Carlos's extended absences, each insinuation carefully crafted to seem like genuine concern rather than malice. "I heard she was a nurse before," one socialite whispered at a fundraiser. "Fired, apparently. Makes you wonder why someone with medical training would choose to be a maid." The fortress of privilege Carlos had built around his family, the respect his wealth commanded, the privacy his status afforded, was suddenly vulnerable to attack from within. The very social circles that had once protected him now buzzed with speculation. Clara watched from her terrace as Carlos's sleek vehicle pulled into his driveway one evening. She smiled, satisfied with the discord she had sown. The billionaire might control his business empire, but Clara controlled something perhaps more valuable, the narrative that defined his family in the eyes of their peers. What Carlos didn't yet realize was that in their world of wealth and appearance, perception often trumped truth, and Clara Martins was a master at shaping perception. A week after his return, Carlos Costa found himself drawn to the kitchen by the rich aroma of feijoada and freshly brewed coffee. The scent reminded him of childhood Sundays at his father's estate, a rare moment of nostalgia in his otherwise forward-looking mind. The kitchen, with its warm terracotta tiles and copper pots hanging from the ceiling, stood in stark contrast to the rest of the mansion's minimalist design. Maria Silva was at the sink, her back to him as she methodically dried her hands on her apron. The silence between them hung heavy, broken only by the gentle bubbling of the traditional Brazilian stew on the stove. Carlos cleared his throat, and the maid turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Daniel has already eaten," she said simply, anticipating his question. "Eduardo took him to the garden to play." Carlos nodded, uncomfortable with how easily she read his intentions. He moved toward the counter, noticing a soup ladle resting on the marble surface instead of hanging with the other utensils. Such disorder was unusual in his meticulously maintained home. "Is everything all right?" he asked, gesturing toward the misplaced item. Maria's eyes followed his, and for a brief moment, something like worry flashed across her face before she composed herself. "Yes, senor, I was just about to put it away." The billionaire watched as she returned the ladle to its proper hook, her movements efficient and practiced. Something about her demeanor bothered him, a guardedness that hadn't been there before his 6-month absence. Had she always been this formal with him? He couldn't remember. What Maria didn't know, what no one in the household knew, was that a small security camera was concealed in the decorative molding above the pantry. Carlos had installed it himself before his extended business trip, citing security concerns to the private contractor who had supplied the equipment. He'd originally justified the surveillance as protection for his son and home while he was away. Now, however, as he observed Maria's careful movements and measured words, he found himself wondering what else the camera might reveal. The footage would show who truly cared for Daniel during those long nights when nightmares came, who listened to his stories, who made him laugh. Carlos excused himself, retreating to his study where monitors could access every security feed in the mansion. His finger hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. Whatever he discovered would change things, perhaps in ways he wasn't prepared to face. The glass elevator ascended 60 floors, offering a panoramic view of São Paulo's sprawling skyline. Carlos Costa adjusted his silk tie as he prepared to meet his father. The exclusive rooftop restaurant in Jardins was Henrique Costa's preferred venue for their monthly meetings, business mixed with family obligation. "You look tired," Henrique remarked, not bothering with pleasantries as Carlos took his seat. The older man's silver hair gleamed under the restaurant's ambient lighting, his posture still commanding respect at 73. "International deals are exhausting," Carlos replied, accepting a glass of sparkling water from the waiter. "But everything is under control." Henrique's eyes narrowed. "And at home, how is Daniel adjusting to your return?" Carlos hesitated, recalling his son's nervous glances. "He's fine. The staff maintains his routine perfectly." "The staff," Henrique repeated, cutting into his steak. "You mean that maid, Maria, isn't it? Clara Martins mentioned she's quite involved with the boy." Carlos felt his jaw tighten. Clara's interference was becoming problematic. "The Maria Silva is competent and Daniel trusts her. That's what matters." "What matters," his father countered, "is that your son recognizes you as his father, not some employee as his parent. Have you truly reconnected with him, or are you just maintaining appearances?" The question hung between them, uncomfortable and accusatory. Carlos changed the subject to quarterly projections, but his father's words followed him home like a shadow. That evening, Carlos found Daniel in the garden, attempting to catch fireflies in the twilight. He approached slowly, conscious of Eduardo watching from near the garage, the chauffeur's concern evident even from a distance. "Having fun?" Carlos asked, reaching to ruffle his son's hair. Daniel flinched at his touch, stepping backward. "I'm okay," he mumbled, eyes downcast. "And Maria said dinner is almost ready." Carlos felt something crack inside him, a hairline fracture in his carefully constructed world. He watched his son hurry back to the house, seeking the comfort of the kitchen where Maria would be waiting with her gentle smile and reassuring presence. Later, alone in his study with a glass of aged cachaça, Carlos stared at the family portrait on his desk. For the first time, he wondered if control was slipping through his fingers. The disconnect between father and son gnawed at him like a physical pain. Was the empire he'd built worth anything if his own child couldn't bear his touch? The values he'd always held sacred, discipline, achievement, legacy, suddenly seemed hollow when measured against Daniel's happiness. Carlos drained his glass, the expensive liquor bitter on his tongue. Perhaps his father was right about one thing. Appearances could be maintained perfectly, while everything that truly mattered fell apart. The autumn air felt crisp as Carlos Costa strolled alongside Maria Silva and Daniel through the winding paths of Ibirapuera Park. Orange and yellow leaves crunched beneath their feet, creating a natural symphony that complemented the distant laughter of other families enjoying the weekend. Carlos had suggested the outing in a rare attempt to connect with his son, though Daniel still kept a careful distance from him, staying close to Maria's side. "Would you like a cookie?" Maria asked, pulling a small container from her bag. Daniel nodded eagerly, his small hands reaching for the homemade treat. The maid smiled, watching him take a large, enthusiastic bite. Seconds later, panic erupted. Daniel's eyes widened as he clutched his throat. His face reddening as he struggled to breathe. A piece of cookie had lodged in his airway. Before Carlos could even process what was happening, Maria moved with practiced precision. She positioned herself behind the boy, wrapped her arms around his small frame, and performed the Heimlich maneuver with confident, measured thrusts. 1, 2, 3, and suddenly the cookie piece shot from Daniel's mouth. He gasped, drawing in desperate breaths as tears streamed down his face. You're okay, Maria soothed, her voice steady despite the crisis that had just unfolded. She held him close, rubbing circles on his back as his breathing normalized. Carlos stood frozen, useless in the face of danger. "How did you know exactly what to do?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely audible. "I was a nurse for 8 years before I started working in homes," she replied simply, still focused on comforting Daniel. "D'emergency pediatrics." The revelation struck Carlos like a physical blow. This woman who cleaned his floors and cooked their meals had once saved lives professionally. He'd never bothered to ask about her past, her training, her life before she entered his service. Later that night, after Maria had tucked Daniel into bed with extra care, Carlos found himself lingering in the doorway of his son's bedroom. The soft glow of the nightlight illuminated the child's peaceful face. So different from the terrified expression he'd worn hours earlier. If she hadn't been there, he whispered to himself, unable to complete the thought. He retreated to his study, pouring himself a glass of aged cachaça from Minas Gerais. The truth was undeniable. Maria wasn't just an employee. She was the reason his son was sleeping safely tonight. The realization weighed on him, a debt he hadn't acknowledged until now. Carlos had built his fortune recognizing value, yet he'd failed to see the most valuable person under his own roof. The autumn breeze swept through the Morumbi neighborhood, carrying the scent of rain and fallen leaves. Outside the imposing gates of the Costa mansion, São Paulo continued its relentless pace. But inside, time seemed to slow as orange and golden leaves carpeted the manicured garden. Daniel Costa had been chasing a paper airplane across the lawn, his small feet crunching through the colorful foliage. "Look how far it went," the 6-year-old called out, his voice bright with excitement, but as he darted forward, his foot caught on an exposed root, sending him tumbling onto the stone pathway. The scrape wasn't severe, but to a child, the sudden pain and sight of blood were overwhelming. Daniel's face crumpled, tears welling instantly in his eyes as he clutched his knee. Maria Silva, who had been hanging laundry nearby, dropped the basket and rushed to his side. "Let me see." "Querido," she said softly, her hands gentle as they examined the injury. The boy didn't hesitate. He launched himself into her arms, burying his face against her shoulder, his small body shaking with sobs. "It hurts," he whimpered, clinging to her apron. I know," Maria soothed, stroking his hair. "But you're so brave. Remember what we say about brave boys." Daniel nodded against her shoulder. "They get special bandages," he whispered through his tears. From the terrace, Carlos Costa watched the scene unfold, a cup of coffee forgotten in his hand. The tenderness between them was palpable, even from a distance. Maria didn't just clean his son's wound, she murmured reassurances, made him laugh through his tears, and promised him they would make his favorite dessert later. A sharp pang of inadequacy struck Carlos as he observed their interaction. Would Daniel have run to him with such trust? Would he have known the right words to say? The maid carried his son inside with practiced ease, the boy's arms wrapped around her neck like she was his lifeline. In that moment, Carlos saw with painful clarity how his prolonged absences had created a void in his son's life. A void Maria had filled with patience, consistency, and genuine affection. For the first time since returning home, the businessman questioned whether his drive for perfection in the corporate world had cost him something irreplaceable. His empire of real estate developments across Brazil meant nothing if he remained a stranger to his own child. As the autumn leaves continued to fall around him, Carlos realized that some distances couldn't be measured in miles. But in the moments of connection he had missed while chasing success. The aroma of grilled picanha and garlic bread wafted through the garden as Maria Silva moved gracefully between guests. Her carefully planned weekend barbecue bringing life to the mansion's sprawling backyard. Carlos Costa watched from the shade of a jabuticaba tree, surprised by how effortlessly she had transformed the formal space into something warm and inviting. Daniel raced around with neighborhood children, his laughter echoing across the manicured lawn, a sound Carlos realized he'd missed desperately during his months away. It's quite inappropriate. Don't you think? Clara Martin's voice sliced through the pleasant atmosphere as she huddled with two other women near the dessert table. The way she acts like she owns the place. One has to wonder what exactly goes on when the lights go down. Carlos stiffened, recognizing the malicious undertone. The neighbor's diamond bracelet caught the sunlight as she gestured toward Maria, who was helping Daniel serve cake to an elderly guest. "I've heard things," Clara continued, her voice dripping with false concern. "A maid and her employer, so cliché, yet so predictable." The women tittered, unaware that Carlos had approached. He stood silently behind them, watching their expressions freeze when they realized he'd overheard everything. "Clara," he said, his voice measured but firm, "I value loyalty and respect in my home. Maria has shown both in abundance. Perhaps you could learn from her example." The gathering fell quiet. Eduardo, who had been manning the grill, exchanged a meaningful glance with Maria across the yard. The chauffeur had warned Carlos about Clara's jealousy weeks ago, but he hadn't expected such a public display of venom. "I merely expressed concern for your reputation," Clara replied, her smile tightening. "As a friend." "Then, as a friend," Carlos responded, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I suggest you direct your concern elsewhere. Maria is family to Daniel, and deserving of respect from everyone who enters our home." The words left his mouth before he could analyze their implications. Family. He'd never used that term for any employee before. Yet as he spoke, he realized the truth in his statement. Later, as guests departed, Carlos overheard whispers about his unusual attachment to the maid. His phone buzzed with a message from his father. "Call me immediately. We need to discuss your public display today." Standing alone on the terrace, watching Maria and Daniel clean up together, Carlos understood that defending her had crossed a line in his social circle. The repercussions would be swift and potentially damaging to business relationships cultivated over decades. Yet for the first time in years, he felt he'd made a choice based on what was right, not what was expected. The cost of that choice would soon become painfully clear. The summer storm descended upon São Paulo without warning, lashing against the mansion's windows with violent intensity. Carlos Costa had just settled into his study when the power flickered once, twice, then died completely. The security system, his pride and technological fortress, went dark, its cameras and sensors rendered useless. "Eduardo, check the breakers," Carlos called out, his voice barely audible over the thunder. The chauffeur nodded and disappeared down the corridor, flashlight in hand. Across the mansion, Maria Silva was lighting candles in the kitchen when she heard a small shuffling sound. Daniel Costa had slipped away from his bedroom, frightened by the storm's fury. "I can't sleep," the boy whispered, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. "The thunder sounds angry." Maria smiled gently, taking his small hand. "It's just the sky having a conversation with the earth," she explained, her voice steady despite the howling wind outside. "Let's find your father." As they navigated the darkened hallways, Daniel suddenly pulled away, distracted by a flashing light coming from the game room. "Look!" he exclaimed, darting toward the doorway before Maria could stop him. Inside, rainwater had seeped through a poorly sealed window, pooling dangerously near an electrical outlet. The faulty wire, which Carlos had postponed repairing despite Eduardo's warnings, sparked erratically, casting eerie blue flashes across the room. Daniel, curious and unaware of the danger, stepped forward just as a particularly bright spark erupted. "Daniel! No!" Maria's voice cut through the darkness. Years of nursing experience took over as she lunged forward, grabbing the child and pulling him backward with such force that they both tumbled onto the carpet. The outlet exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke, leaving a black scorch mark on the expensive wallpaper where Daniel had stood just seconds before. Carlos arrived at the doorway, drawn by the commotion. His face drained of color as he processed the scene, the smoking outlet, his son trembling in Maria's protective embrace, the narrow margin between safety and tragedy. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear. Maria explained calmly, her hands still steady as she checked Daniel for any injuries. "The wire you mentioned last month," she said simply, "son," without accusation. Carlos knelt beside them. His usual composure shattered. He reached for his son, who clung to Maria for a moment before accepting his father's embrace. "If you hadn't been here," Carlos began, unable to finish the thought. Maria nodded, understanding the unspoken words. In that moment, illuminated only by the storm's lightning and the flashlight Eduardo had brought, Carlos saw Maria not as his employee, but as his son's guardian angel, a woman whose quick thinking had prevented an unthinkable loss. Carlos Costa paced the length of his study, the memory of sparks and smoke still fresh in his mind. The electrical accident in the game room had shaken him to his core. If Maria Silva hadn't acted so quickly, Daniel could have been seriously injured, or worse. The thought made his stomach clench. He paused at the window overlooking the garden where his son was playing. The boy looked carefree now, laughing as he kicked a ball across the manicured lawn. Maria sat nearby on a stone bench, alert yet relaxed, her eyes never straying far from Daniel. "She saved him," Carlos whispered to himself, the realization settling heavy on his shoulders. For years, he had maintained strict boundaries between himself and the household staff. They were employees, not family, but watching Maria with Daniel now forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. She had become more than just the maid. She was his son's protector, his confidant, his anchor in a world that had been turned upside down when his mother left. Carlos pressed his forehead against the cool glass. The walls of class distinction he'd built so carefully were beginning to crumble. What did it matter that Maria came from a humble background when she had shown more courage and compassion than many of his wealthy associates? Eduardo knocked softly before entering with coffee. "Sir, is everything all right?" The chauffeur's concerned expression reminded Carlos how his household had been watching him struggle with these revelations. "I've been blind, Eduardo," Carlos admitted, accepting the cup. "I've been so focused on maintaining appearances that I failed to see what was happening in my own home." Eduardo nodded thoughtfully. "Daniel needs stability. Maria gives him that." Later that evening, Carlos found himself standing outside his son's bedroom, listening to Maria's gentle voice as she read a bedtime story. The tenderness in her tone made his chest ache with a mixture of gratitude and regret. When she emerged, closing the door quietly behind her, Carlos surprised them both by saying, "Thank you, not just for yesterday, but for everything you've done for him." Maria's eyes widened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "It's my job, sir." "No," Carlos shook his head. "What you do goes far beyond your job description." As she walked away, Carlos realized he needed to reevaluate everything, his priorities, his prejudices, even his definition of family. The mansion suddenly felt different, as if the near tragedy had stripped away pretense and exposed what truly mattered. The businessman who prided himself on control was finally acknowledging that some of life's most valuable connections couldn't be bought or managed. They could only be recognized and treasured. Winter settled into São Paulo with an unusual bite, sending cold winds whistling through the corridors of the Costa mansion. The marble floors seemed icier, the high ceilings more cavernous as the temperature dropped. Carlos Costa had always prided himself on his emotional control, but tonight was different. Alone in his study, surrounded by leather-bound books and business accolades, his chest suddenly tightened. His breathing became shallow and rapid. The room began to spin as memories of his wife's departure crashed over him like waves. The photograph on his desk, the three of them smiling in Ibirapuera Park, now seemed to mock him. Carlos clutched at his chest, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. "I can't breathe," he gasped, loosening his tie with trembling fingers. The billionaire slid from his chair to the floor, back against the mahogany desk. As the panic attack gripped him with merciless intensity, in this moment of raw vulnerability, all his wealth and power meant nothing. The door creaked open, and Maria Silva appeared, a stack of freshly laundered towels in her arms. She dropped them immediately upon seeing her employer collapsed on the floor. "Mr. Costa," she approached cautiously, kneeling beside him, "try to breathe with me, slowly." Her voice was steady, professional, remnants of her nursing background evident in her calm demeanor. Maria placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, maintaining a respectful distance, while still offering support. "In through your nose, out through your mouth," she instructed, demonstrating the breathing technique. "That's it." Carlos followed her guidance, his eyes locked on hers as he struggled to regain control. The maid's presence was unexpectedly anchoring. Her brown eyes reflecting not judgment, but understanding. "Enrique would be ashamed," Carlos whispered once his breathing steadied. "My father never showed weakness." Maria's expression softened. "With respect, sir, this isn't weakness. Even the strongest people need help sometimes." The simplicity of her words cut through years of conditioning. In that moment, Carlos saw himself reflected in Daniel's struggles, both of them desperately needing connection, but trapped behind walls of expectation and fear. "How do you help him?" Carlos asked, his voice barely audible. "My son, when he's afraid." "I just sit with him," Maria replied. "Sometimes that's all anyone needs, to not be alone." As she helped him to his feet, Carlos felt something shift inside him. The realization dawned that vulnerability wasn't his enemy, but perhaps the bridge he needed to cross, to reach his son, to heal himself, to become the man he truly wanted to be. "Thank you," he said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. Maria nodded, retrieving the fallen towels. "We all need someone sometimes, Mr. Costa, even billionaires." The vibrant energy of Carnival swept through São Paulo, transforming the usually business-focused Avenida 23 de Mayo into a river of color and sound. Daniel Costa stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his small hand gripping Maria Silva's with white-knuckle intensity. The 6-year-old's eyes widened with a mixture of wonder and terror as costumed dancers whirled past in a blur of feathers and sequins. "I'm scared," he whispered, pressing himself against Maria's side. "There are too many people." The maid knelt down to his level, her face gentle but determined. "Look at me, Daniel. We'll take one small step at a time. I'll be right beside you the whole way." From 20 feet away, Carlos Costa observed the interaction, maintaining enough distance to remain unnoticed. He'd intended to surprise them by joining their outing, but something held him back, a desire to witness, unfiltered, how his son navigated the world without him. Maria pointed to a group of dancers with elaborate butterfly wings. "See how beautiful. Let's count the colors together." Her strategy worked brilliantly. With each number, Daniel's grip loosened slightly, his focus shifting from fear to fascination. When a performer approached with a small trinket, a beaded bracelet in carnival colors, Daniel hesitated before accepting it. The boy looked up at Maria for reassurance, and her encouraging nod gave him the confidence to extend his hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible above the samba rhythms. Carlos watched as his son's shoulders relaxed, his posture opening up like a flower to the sun. The businessman had witnessed Maria's care in their home countless times, but seeing her navigate this public challenge, this fear that Carlos himself had never known about, revealed dimensions to her role he'd never appreciated. A memory surfaced, his own father, Enrique, refusing to acknowledge childhood fears, insisting that Costamen showed no weakness. How different Maria's approach was, acknowledging the fear while building courage through small victories. When a particularly loud drum section passed by, Daniel startled but quickly recovered, looking up at Maria with a tentative smile that soon blossomed into genuine delight. "Can we move closer?" he asked, pointing toward a float decorated with mythical creatures. Carlos felt something shift inside him, a realization that family wasn't defined by blood or obligation alone. It was built in these moments of growth, in the gentle guidance that transformed fear into joy. As the parade continued its colorful journey down the Avenue, Carlos understood that Maria wasn't merely filling a gap in Daniel's life. She was expanding his world in ways that transcended her job description. She was, in every meaningful sense, his hero. The vibrant murals of Biko do Batman surrounded them in a kaleidoscope of colors as the jazz quartet played beneath the afternoon sun. Maria Silva had suggested this outing, knowing Daniel's growing interest in music. The 6-year-old bounced excitedly between the performers, his face alight with wonder as he absorbed the melodies floating through the graffiti-lined alley. Carlos Costa watched from a few steps away, surprised by how at ease his son seemed in this bohemian corner of São Paulo, so different from their sheltered existence in Morumbi. He observed Maria smiling as she pointed out different instruments to Daniel, her usual composure making the crowded space seem safe and welcoming. Then it happened. A group of well-dressed women near the makeshift stage erupted in laughter, their eyes darting toward Maria and Daniel. Their whispers weren't quite audible, but their meaning was clear in their sideways glances and smirks. One woman, a business associate's wife Carlos recognized from charity events, made a dismissive gesture that spoke volumes. Maria's smile faltered. Her breathing quickened, her hand instinctively reaching for the wall beside her. The maid's eyes widened slightly, her other hand pressed against her chest as she tried to maintain her composure. The drum beat from the performance seemed to accelerate in time with her racing heart. Carlos had seen this before, not in Maria, but in himself during late-night panic attacks in his study. The familiar signs were unmistakable. The shallow breathing, the distant gaze, the slight tremor in her fingers as she clutched her phone. Without thinking, he crossed the space between them. "Daniel, why don't you ask the saxophone player about his instrument?" he suggested, gently guiding his son toward the musicians. Then, turning to Maria, he lowered his voice. "Focus on my voice. 5 things you can see. 4 you can touch." Her eyes met his, surprised by his understanding. 3 things you can hear," he continued, his hand hovering near but not touching her elbow, offering support without invasion. 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. Slowly, her breathing steadied. The moment hung between them, employer and employee. Yet suddenly, just 2 people recognizing pain in each other. "Thank you," she whispered, straightening her posture. "I didn't expect." "Neither did I," Carlos admitted, glancing toward the group of women who had moved on, oblivious to the damage their casual cruelty had caused. "We all have our battles, don't we?" The music swelled around them as Daniel returned, chattering excitedly about the instruments. But something had shifted between Carlos and Maria, a recognition that beneath their different circumstances lay the same human vulnerabilities, the same capacity for hurt and healing. Paula Souza arrived at the Costa mansion precisely at 10 in the morning, her recorder and notebook ready for what she had initially thought would be a straightforward piece about rare books and architectural design. Carlos Costa greeted her with practiced politeness, leading her through the grand foyer toward the library that had been featured in several architectural magazines. "The collection started with my grandfather," Carlos explained as they passed through corridors adorned with Brazilian modernist art. His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to impressing visitors, but something in his demeanor had softened since agreeing to this interview months ago. As Paula admired the first edition works, Maria Silva entered with a tray of coffee and pain de queijo. The journalist noticed the gentle way Daniel clung to the maid's apron, whispering something that made her smile. There was an unmistakable warmth in their interaction that caught Paula's professional curiosity. "Maria has been with us for 4 years," Carlos offered, noticing Paula's interest. "She's become essential to this household in ways I never anticipated." During a tour of the garden, Paula observed Maria helping Daniel overcome his fear of a particularly large butterfly. The tenderness in the scene prompted her to ask questions that veered from her original assignment. Maria's background as a nurse, her quiet dignity despite Clara Martin's persistent rumors, and her unwavering dedication to Daniel formed a narrative far more compelling than rare books. With Carlos' unexpected permission, the focus of the article shifted. When published in Folha de São Paulo's weekend supplement, The Heart of a Billionaire's Home portrayed Maria not as a servant, but as the emotional anchor of the Costa family. It detailed how she had transformed a cold mansion into a home through small, meaningful acts of care. The piece went viral within hours. Comments flooded social media, with readers sharing similar stories of unsung heroes in their lives. Television programs requested interviews, and several prominent business leaders publicly praised Carlos for acknowledging Maria's contribution. Yet the spotlight brought complications. Eduardo noticed increased paparazzi outside the gates, forcing him to take alternative routes when driving Daniel to school. Enrique Costa called his son, concerned about the family's public image being tied so closely to an employee. "You've made our private life public," he warned. "There will be consequences." Carlos, standing at his study window watching Maria teach Daniel how to plant seedlings in the garden, realized the article had changed something fundamental. Their story was no longer contained within these walls. For better or worse, the truth of their unusual bond had become part of a larger conversation about class, care, and what truly constitutes family in modern Brazil. The article in São Paulo's most prestigious magazine had transformed Maria Silva's small literacy program in the favela into an overnight sensation. What began as weekend reading sessions for underprivileged children now attracted university students, retired teachers, and even corporate volunteers, all inspired by the story of the maid who created a sanctuary of learning while caring for a billionaire's son. Maria watched in disbelief as 3 delivery trucks unloaded donated books at the community center. "I never imagined this would happen," she whispered to Eduardo Pereira, who had volunteered his Sundays to drive children to and from the sessions. "You deserve this recognition," the chauffeur replied, helping a young boy carry a stack of colorful encyclopedias. Across town, Clara Martins seethed as she scrolled through the comments on Paula's article. The neighbor had always viewed herself as Morumbi's social conscience, and Maria's sudden popularity threatened her carefully cultivated influence. At her weekly garden brunch, Clara delicately raised her concerns. "It's wonderful what the Silva woman is doing," she said, stirring her mimosa. "But I worry about young Daniel. All this exposure And Carlos, allowing his son to frequent those neighborhoods. "I'm simply concerned for the boy's safety." Her words spread through São Paulo's elite circles like poison, disguised as compassion. Carlos Costa felt the pressure mounting from all sides. His smartphone buzzed constantly with messages from business partners questioning his judgment. 3 sponsors for his company's annual charity gala threatened to withdraw, citing brand alignment concerns, corporate speak for disapproval of his public support of Maria. "And your father called again," his assistant informed him during a tense meeting. "He insists you need to contain the situation before the Costa name becomes associated with controversy." That evening, Carlos found Maria in the kitchen, exhausted but smiling as she prepared Daniel's lunch for the next day. "The foundation that funds the community center called," she said, not looking up from the sandwich she was carefully cutting. "They're concerned about the attention. They suggested I step back from the program to avoid complications." Carlos watched her steady hands continue their work, despite the heartbreak in her voice. He thought about the board meeting scheduled for tomorrow, where he would face skeptical investors and his father's disapproval. He thought about Daniel, who had proudly told his teacher about helping at Miss Maria's library. "I'll handle the foundation," Carlos said firmly. "And anyone else who has a problem with your work?" Maria finally looked up, surprise in her eyes. "Some things matter more than appearances," he added, the weight of his decision settling comfortably on his shoulders. For the first time in years, Carlos felt certain he was doing exactly what was right, regardless of the cost. Unable to sleep, Carlos Costa wandered through the darkened corridors of his mansion, the weight of recent revelations pressing on his mind. The marble floors echoed beneath his bare feet as he made his way to his study, drawn by an impulse he couldn't ignore. Settling into his leather chair, he accessed the security system on his device, fingers hovering over the kitchen camera footage he'd installed months ago. The screen illuminated his face as he scrolled back through days of recordings. What he witnessed left him transfixed. There was Maria Silva, long after her work hours had ended, sitting with Daniel at the kitchen table, patiently helping him with mathematics homework. Her gentle encouragement when he struggled with fractions was a stark contrast to Carlos's own demanding approach. In another clip, his son woke screaming from a nightmare. Instead of calling for his father, Daniel had padded to Maria's quarters. The maid didn't hesitate. She wrapped him in a blanket, prepared warm milk, and sang softly until his trembling subsided. Carlos watched his son's face transform from terror to peace in her presence. The footage continued, revealing countless moments he'd missed. Maria defending Daniel from Clara Martins's prying questions during an unexpected visit. The former nurse applying antiseptic to a scraped knee with practiced hands, teaching him to fold paper cranes when rain cancelled a planned outing, shielding him from overhearing Eduardo discussing Carlos's latest business scandal. Tears welled in his eyes as he watched Maria place a photo of Daniel's absent mother on his nightstand, explaining gently that sometimes people leave, but their love remains. She never spoke ill of anyone, not even of Carlos himself, despite his coldness toward her. The billionaire pushed away from his desk, overwhelmed. The truth was undeniable. This woman, whom he'd regarded as merely an employee, had become the emotional center of his home. Her value couldn't be measured in tasks completed or hours worked, but in the love she poured into his broken family. For Carlos, this silent testimony was the proof he needed to silence every doubt, both his own and those whispered by neighbors like Clara. Maria wasn't a threat or an intruder. She was the heart his home had been missing. The businessman who prided himself on recognizing value had failed to see the greatest asset under his roof. He closed the laptop, a decision crystallizing in his mind. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of changes, not just in his relationship with Maria, but in how he viewed family, loyalty, and what truly constituted wealth. The crescendo came on a rainy evening, the droplets tapping against the mansion's windows like nature's own percussion. The rich, soulful voice of Maria Bethania flowed through the sound system, filling every corner of the Costa residence with melancholy and hope. Carlos Costa had arranged everything meticulously, a rare trait now channeled toward emotional connection rather than control. In the spacious living room, with its high ceilings and imported furniture, Maria Silva stood confused as household staff gathered around. Daniel clutched her hand tightly, his small fingers intertwined with hers, in a gesture of complete trust. Eduardo Pereira watched from near the doorway, a knowing smile playing on his lips as he observed his employer's transformation. "I've called everyone here because some things need to be said publicly," Carlos announced, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he lowered himself to one knee before Maria. The maid's eyes widened in shock. "Señor Costa, what are you—" "Please," he interrupted gently, "let me speak." Rain intensified outside, drumming against the roof as if emphasizing the importance of this moment. "Maria, you didn't just save my son from physical danger. You saved him from emotional abandonment, from me." Daniel squeezed her hand tighter as Carlos continued. "You showed me what true strength looks like, not in wealth or power, but in compassion and courage." The staff exchanged glances, some surprised, others nodding in agreement. For years, they had witnessed Maria's quiet dignity in the face of gossip and prejudice, particularly from Clara Martins and her circle. "From today," Carlos declared, "my company will implement new policies supporting women from backgrounds like yours, creating pathways to leadership, not just service." His voice cracked slightly. "Because you've been the true leader in this house." Maria's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. "I only did what anyone would do for Daniel." "No," Carlos shook his head. "You did what I should have done, but couldn't. You taught me how." Eduardo stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Carlos's shoulder, a breach of professional boundaries that now felt perfectly natural. Daniel broke away from Maria and wrapped his arms around both adults, creating a circle that represented their unlikely bond. That night, after the others had departed, Carlos sat alone in his study. He drafted the framework for a foundation that would support domestic workers, education and advancement. Outside, the storm had cleared, leaving behind the fresh scent of possibility. For the first time in years, the billionaire felt truly wealthy. The golden sunset painted the sky in magnificent hues of orange and crimson as it descended behind the infinity pool. Daniel Costa sat cross-legged on the veranda, his small fingers dancing across the strings of his guitar. The melody floated through the evening air, accompanied by his carefree laughter that echoed across the garden, a sound that had once been rare in the marble halls of the Morumbi mansion. Maria Silva watched from the doorway, her eyes filled with quiet pride. She remembered the trembling boy who had clung to her that rainy afternoon 6 months ago. Now, as she placed a glass of fresh juice beside him, the child looked up with eyes that no longer carried the weight of abandonment. Play that song again," Carlos called as he emerged from his study, documents forgotten on his desk. The businessman loosened his tie and joined his son on the wooden bench, their shoulders touching in comfortable familiarity. Eduardo Pereira observed the scene from near the garage, a smile crossing his weathered face. The chauffeur had witnessed the transformation of this household, from cold efficiency to genuine warmth, and felt a sense of satisfaction in having played even a small part in that journey. Inside, the staff moved with ease, no longer walking on eggshells. The mansion had become a home again, its atmosphere transformed by something more valuable than the expensive art adorning its walls. Later that evening, as stars appeared in the darkening sky, Carlos found Maria folding laundry in the utility room. "I received a call from Enrique today," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "He's finally coming to visit next weekend." She nodded, remembering how his father's sharp questions had once planted seeds of doubt. "Daniel will be excited to see his grandfather, and Clara Martins has put her house up for sale," Carlos added with a hint of satisfaction. "Apparently, the neighborhood no longer meets her standards." They shared a knowing smile, recalling how the neighbor's poisonous gossip had nearly destroyed everything. As Maria finished her tasks for the night, she passed the kitchen where the hidden camera once recorded her every move. That device had been removed weeks ago, a symbol of trust restored. Carlos Costa stood on the balcony, watching the lights of São Paulo twinkle in the distance. The billionaire who had built his empire on precision and control had discovered a different kind of wealth in these walls. True fortune, he now understood, wasn't measured in reais or property deeds, but in the courage to acknowledge mistakes and embrace those who remain steadfast beside us. The scars of recent months had faded into something beautiful, a family rebuilt on foundations of trust, respect, and profound gratitude, proof that sometimes what appears to be broken can be transformed into something far stronger than before.